a book within a book, and a story behind the story. This is chapter 23 of Author Talks with Lisa T, and coming up, I chat with best-selling author Patti Callahan Henry about her new historical novel, The Story She Left Behind. Set in the US and England in the early 1950s, this story centers around a missing author, her lost book, and the daughter looking for them both. Did I mention it's also inspired by a real-life literary mystery? And, lest I forget, it also features that little bit of magic that Patti loves to weave into all of her stories. Before I can ask you about the real life story that inspired this story, I want you to first tell us a little bit about what readers can expect when they pick up this book.
The story she left behind is about a daughter who has just discovered that the mother who left her and disappeared when she is 8 years old, that a secret language she created has been found across the ocean in London. So at first we open watching the mother disappear 25 years ago. And then in 1952, we meet the daughter Clara. And a call comes in from a man in London who says that he has this secret language her mother created in his library. At first, she doesn't believe him because all of her life, all of Clara's life, people have been after her mother's story and the truth, and this sequel she wrote to her novel, written in this secret language. So she doesn't believe him. She thinks he's another scammer out after her mother's work until he says one word from the dictionary. And she heads off across the ocean with her own 8-year-old daughter, and complications ensue.
Now, you've told us that, and it seems almost too fantastical to be real, and yet your author with a secret language is based on a real life woman.
It is. So the inspiration for this novel was a woman, a very real woman named Barbara Newhall Follett. Barbara Newhall Follett was born in 1914, and she wrote her very first and very famous children's fantasy novel called The House Without Windows when she was 8 years old. It was published when she was 12 years old by Knopf, as you know, one of the most famous literary houses in New York. And it was praised by the New York Times as a literary masterpiece, as an act of brilliance. And yet, after that, although Barbara kept writing, including creating an entire language and fantasy world, not a few words, Lisa, but an entire linguistic system. At 25 years old, she married, she settled down. Her career had faltered no matter what the promise of a star career had been. And she found out her husband was having an affair. They got in an argument, and one December night in 1939, she walked out the front door of their apartment and was never seen again. Now, not for lack of trying. The police searched, the husband searched, her parents sent out SOSs trying to find her. But in the end, it is still an unsolved cold case mystery, an author who vanished. There are lots of theories out there. And if you want to fall down that rabbit hole, there is a website called Fark Solia, Fark Solia, and it is the name of the language that she created. And yet, for all of this brilliance and all of this fame, because The House Without Windows is still in print, all of her work, 16 boxes of it, sit gathering dust in the Columbia University Library archives. And that did not settle well with me. And for authors, if there is an ending, is not an ending, we make one up. So all this, though this novel is inspired by Barbara, it is actually about a created fictional character named Bronwyn.
So tell me what that kind of aha moment is like when you stumble across this story of Barbara, and I'm sure like a light goes off, a switch gets flipped where you're like, this is my next book.
Absolutely. I love the subject, Lisa, of where do ideas come from. I think it is one of the most fascinating thing to talk about other authors with. Like, can you nail that first spark or that first idea? And it's often in answers, and it is for me something kind of in the body. So I'll get a tingle down the back of my neck, a tingle down my arms, or just this moment of pause. And I always say that that is my curiosity. And I ignore my curiosity at my own creative peril. If I'm curious about something or I'm getting that little tingly sense, I heard another author, Emily Haybeck, describe it as something in her chest. So it's often a something in the body. I pause and I read about it, and I knew immediately I was actually writing about something different when I found Barbara. I actually thought I was going to write a novel about Beatrix Potter, and I had discovered that Beatrix Potter created a coded language so that her mother couldn't read her diaries, which I thought was fascinating. But that sent me down a trail of women who make up languages, and that's how I found Barbara. And I immediately knew I was either going to write a book about her or inspired by her. And in the end, I didn't want to give a fake ending to a real person because it is unsolved. So I fictionalized her and gave my fictional character her background, her family, her wounds, all of it.
Trix Potter that sent you down the rabbit hole.
Isn't that fun? Okay, I'm glad you noticed that little Easter egg ode to there. Yes.
And Beatrix does make an appearance in this book.
Yes.
And I love that you explore the reason why these women had to or felt that they had to make up their own languages from this angle of protecting their personal thoughts and also protecting what they were thinking from, for lack of a better word, the patriarchy.
Oh, I love that you noticed that. So the first thing I started with when I read about Barbara and started, I ordered her books and her letters and her journal things, and I found a biography written by a psychiatrist because my first question was, why would anyone make up a language? Like, I'm struggling to use this one. Why would I want to make up an entirely new language? And as I discovered in my research, people do it for different reasons, right? So Beatrix Potter did it so her mother couldn't read her diary. Tolkien did it because he was a linguistics and mythology expert and thought it would be fun. And then he put it in a novel. He made up the language long before he wrote the book, which I also thought was fascinating. And other authors have made up a word or two, and they've ended up in our English language. Like Dr. Seuss made up the word nerd, and now we use it. Lewis Carroll made up the word chortle. Now we use it. So authors have made up words, but why a whole language? And what I discovered for Barbara and for my character Bronwyn is that it was not just an act of whimsy or imagination. It was an actual belief that the world was so overwhelming to them because they were, a child prodigy, a genius, that the language we had wasn't enough for what they felt and a lot what they saw in the natural world. So Barbara was very enchanted and wrote a lot about the natural world. Her character in her fantasy novel disappeared into the fairy realm. So a lot of what she wrote about was what surrounded her in the woods and lakes. And she would make up words because she felt like the ones we had were not enough.
And you actually play with making up your own language for this book. After hearing you say all that, was it a chore for you or did you have fun doing it?
Oh, I loved doing a word or two. I just thought it was like really interesting. And I always encourage people to do it. It's really interesting to sit back and wonder, is there something in my life that I would want to describe and we don't have a word for it? A feeling or a moment or something inside of us that we don't have a word to describe. And um, I was able to do that in this novel. One of the words being a very particular feeling of love, especially for a child, the way one might feel about a garden or being outside. And I was took Latin in high school instead of a language you can take on vacation. And I smashed up my knowledge of Latin, the rudimentary knowledge of Gaelic, and then some of Barbara's actual words. So I took inspiration from the words she created because they were things she wanted to express in the world. So making up a word or two was fun, but when I look at her whole linguistic system, she has rules and syntax and prefix and so, no, thank you. No, thank you.
I I took Latin in high school as well. I had to
Oh,
take a
did you?
modern and an ancient language. So I did notice some of the Latin roots popping in. I'm like, okay, I can identify that part of the word.
Yes, yes. And I love that. I mean, I did that in high school. I took Latin in high school because I wanted to go to nursing school, which I did. But I had heard it was really good to take if you were going into medicine. But it had the opposite effect for me. I fell in love with language and mythology and all of that. So,
So speaking of words, the definition of how someone defines home is
mm.
a big theme in this book. What does that particular word mean to you?
Oh, home is where the people I love are. I moved around a lot when I was young. I grew up outside Philadelphia. I moved to South Florida. We moved a couple times within South Florida. I went to 4 schools in 4 years. Then I've had no people who've had a lot more moves than I have, but then I went to college in Alabama, but then I lived in Atlanta, and now I'm back in Birmingham. We have a place in South Carolina that I consider home. And I do think we are rooted to certain landscapes that we're attracted to, but the word home is where my people are. Because I've learned to live in so many places. Now there's landscapes I like better than others, but home is where my people are.
I think that's great because that means home moves with you and is
Yes.
not rooted to a place.
I'm not leaving it behind. Yes.
The time period that you set this book in, was that to align as much as you could with Barbara's actual history, or did you stumble across, we get this great setting of London during the Great Smog, which I think a lot of people are familiar with after watching The Crown.
That's right.
And
Yeah,
I'm just
whenever
curious, like, how did you decide that this was the time period you wanted to set it in?
whenever I do a speech, I say, "Who's heard of the Great Smog of 1952?" And a few people raise their hands. And then I say, "Who has heard of the Great Smog of 1952 because of the crown?" And almost every hand that already raised. So that is how most people have heard of it. No, I originally set it in this time period to coincide in many ways with the life of Barbara Newhall Follett. And then as I started to do my research about that time period, because I knew that we would go to London and then the Lake District in this novel, that was about as much as I knew. I knew that this journey would take Clara and her 8-year-old daughter, Winnie, from Bluffton, South Carolina, across the ocean in the 1950s, onto London, and then onto the Lake District to honor Beatrix Potter. And as I did my research about current events in that time, it was such as often happens when we're writing. I know you hear it over and over, Lisa, that when you commit to a story and you're deep in it, crazy synchronistic things happen. And it was the exact right metaphor for what was going on in their life. So I immediately knew when I read that that was one of the major happenings in England in 1951, 1952, that they would end up in the middle of this great smog, not only being a danger in a literal sense to Winnie, who has asthma, but in a metaphorical, I can't see my way sense.
I love Winnie and I love her imaginary friend that she has. And also just the way that you write that relationship, you're not quite sure if she's got some sort of sixth sense and has this friend, or if the friend is purely just something from her imagination. And we should mention happens to be the main character of the book that her grandmother wrote.
And I loved playing with that. I think I know that I dabble in that in almost all of my novels. This idea of the seen and the unseen world. What is real? What is not? What is more important, logic or imagination? Can we live with one and not the other? Being living only in logic is dangerous. Living only in imagination is dangerous. And how do we balance the push and pull of these two worlds that we have? right? There's two of me. I was a nurse. It's logic. There's only one way to do things. And then there's the me making people up and having imaginary friends.
I
So
never thought
how
of it that way. As an author, you really do have lots of imaginary
lots
friends
of them that I think about all the time.
that are
So
live in your head.
yes, and somebody will say something, I'll be like, that's what she would say. And um, for Winnie, having this imaginary friend serves a lot of purposes. But for the reader, one of them is to wonder how much of this is being directed by the imaginary unseen world to solve this mystery of this mother who loves her daughter and this daughter who loves her mother.
So this is, oh, you know what? Before I get into that question, I'm going to ask you something that plays off of what you just finished saying. Mother-daughter
Yes,
relationships is also another big component
yes,
of this book, the one between Winnie and her mother and between Bronwyn and her daughter. And they're totally different and almost to the point where they have to be so that history can't repeat itself.
exactly. So I am a daughter and I am a mother of a daughter. So, I don't know if that's the only requisition you need to write something like this, but I'm always fascinated, especially as I look at my daughter who just had a daughter. So there's four generations of firstborn daughters in my, actually, I think five now. My mom is a firstborn daughter, then I am, then my daughter is, and then her daughter is.
That's a whole other
So
podcast,
it's a
firstborn
whole nother
daughters.
podcast, right?
That's me too.
Oh, the first daughter of the first daughter of the first daughter of the first daughter. And there's something really powerful about that in many ways. And I wanted to explore that. And also, this idea that we think or want to be possibly a better mother than our mother was to us. And in that, realizing that there's things we don't know.
What have you heard from readers from now that you've been out a little bit and this book has been out in the world?
Oh, I'm so lucky, Lisa. I've been on the road for almost 6 weeks. And, the first weeks that people come up to you, they haven't read it yet, right? But after that, you start to get the people who come and they want to tell you the story about their mother, or they whisper, I don't want to do any spoilers, or they whisper, the reasons that Bronwyn left were the reasons my mother left, right? That they believed these things. And it so touched me. And, all we can hope for as we're sitting alone in a room that I'm sitting in right now, is that we are writing something that might touch someone else or make them feel something, even if they're mad. I mean, I have people who tell me they're mad. They wouldn't have done what Clara did, right? It doesn't matter if they would have or wouldn't have. That's what those characters did. And at least it made them feel. And that's enough for me.
I know this is not the first time you've done like a book within a book. Your
Yes.
last book, which I can see there on the bookshelf behind you, Secret Book of Florley, had similar characteristics. Now, I know that being an author means you must really love books, but I mean you must really love books to give us like these little nested dolls of books, two books in a row.
Oh, I love that you say nesting dolls. That's really great. Even my book, Once Upon a Wardrobe, is a book about a book. But I think that, yes, books have been the foundational elements of my life. And I won't even use the word books, although that's true. It's story. Story has been for me um, a way to navigate the world more than almost anything in my life. So, and there's a science behind that, that we can prove that that's how we navigate the world, but it doesn't really matter whether I can prove that or not prove that. The point is that story has been very important to me, and it is a craft I never stop studying. And I think if we're honest, a lot of people will be able to tell you about a book that changed their life, or a story, even if it's not a book they read, a story that's been passed down. It is what changes us and moves us. And yes, I'm quite obsessed with how and why. And I always want to address it from as many angles as I can.
You think you'll ever run out of stories?
I don't think that's possible. I think, when I get stuck, it's which one to tell. It's not if there are any, it's which one to tell. Which one's worth the next couple years of my life?
That is a big commitment to make.
Yes. Yes.
And a, long-term relationship with those characters who take up space in your head rent free.
Well, and because my last 6, 7 novels have been historical, it's also the research, right?
Mhm.
It'd make my life so much easier, Lisa, if I would just stick to one subject. But I see my they do that. So here we are, right? Every book needs, I have to start from scratch with research for this novel. I have to start with Barbara Newhall Follett on this one and do the research and do the reading and then do the writing. And then so it's not just out talking about them, but it's years of research, reading, writing, and talking about them. So I better be sure it's a story I want to talk about and am committed to.
I'm sure that means the next one is already you're deep in the weeds.
I am deep, and that's actually a really good way to put it because part of it takes place in a national forest.
Oh, I love
So,
that.
yes, I am deep in the weeds and the trees and the fungi, and that, yes, I am.
Excellent. Well, I know it's going to be just as enjoyable as all the other ones you've written. I've been
Thank
talking with Patti Callahan Henry. The newest book is The Story She Left Behind. Thank you so much for spending some time with me today to talk about it.
Oh, Lisa, this was a delight. Thank you for talking to me.
And that's where we close the book on this chapter. If you're interested in reading more about Barbara Newhall Follett, the real life woman who inspired Patty's story, there's a book edited by her half nephew that's made up of letters she wrote and received. It's called Barbara Newhall Follett A Life in Letters. Just don't get too lost going down the rabbit hole. Speaking of rabbit holes, if you're on Instagram, don't forget to follow me at Lisa T Books. Keep turning those pages. I'm Lisa T.